Hello, welcome to this hour of Live from Paris. Good to have you with us. It's 10 p.m. here in the French capital. I'm Belle Lupton. Let's get you up to date with our headlines. UK police say the murder of an MP was an isolated but targeted attack. Their investigation is starting with the killer's links to far-right extremism and his mental health. Russian athletes banned from this year's Rio Olympics. The world's governing athletics body has voted unanimously after a massive doping scandal. And Iraq's army says it's retaken the government headquarters in Fallujah, a city that's been under control of the Islamic State group since January 2014. We begin in the UK, where politicians from all sides have come together to pay tribute to a Member of Parliament killed in a brutal attack. Jo Cox from the Labour Party was shot and stabbed repeatedly in her constituency in the north of England. A 52-year-old local Thomas Mayor has been arrested. The UK police says its investigation is centred around right-wing extremism.
We are aware of the speculation within the media in respect of the suspect's link to mental health services, and this is a clear line of inquiry which we are pursuing. We are also aware of the inference within the media of the suspect being linked to right-wing extremism, which again is a priority line of inquiry which will help us establish the motive for the attack on Jo. Based on the information available at this time, this appears to be an isolated but targeted attack upon Jo.
Dee Collins speaking there from the West Yorkshire Police Constabulary. Now, 41-year-old Cox was a mother of two. Among the causes she fought for, refugee rights and remaining in the EU. The murder of politicians is rare in the UK. The last one was 26 years ago. Rudaba Abbas reports on the reactions to this death.
They came to pay tribute to a woman who was dedicated to helping others live a better life. But in doing so, she died herself. Just 24 hours earlier, British Labour MP Jo Cox was murdered in a frenzied attack in a constituency of Batley in Spen. Political leaders and Westminster colleagues came to lay flowers at the site where she had been brutally shot and stabbed. Prime Minister David Cameron and Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn were the first to express condolences at the vigil.
Today our nation is rightly shocked, and I think it is a moment to stand back and think about some of the things that are so important about our country. And if we truly want to honour Jo, then what we should do is recognise that her values, service, community, tolerance, the values she lived by and worked by, those are the values that we need to redouble in our national life in the months and in the years to come.
It's an attack on democracy, what happened yesterday. It's the well of hatred that killed her. Jo was an exceptional, wonderful, very talented woman, taken from us in her early 40s when she had so much to give and so much of her life ahead of her. It's a tragedy beyond tragedy what has happened yesterday. In her memory, we will not allow those people that spread hatred and poison to divide our society. We will strengthen our democracy, strengthen our free speech.
In London, the public also paid tribute at Westminster, as the announcement was made that Parliament will be recalled from recess on Monday. Campaigning for Britain's EU referendum has been suspended for a second day, while the nation reels from the shock. As politicians from all persuasions gather to commemorate the loss of a colleague who is gone, her legacy will be far from forgotten.
Well, for more on this, let's bring in Claude Moraes in London. He's a British member of the European Parliament and the Labour Party's chairman, and he joins me on the phone now. And Claude, you knew Jo Cox personally. Thank you for talking to us on what must be a very difficult day for you. What kind of a person was she?
I mean, all the tributes which are being made are very accurate. In fact, I knew her. She worked in the European Parliament. She was a senior assistant to Glenys Kinnock, the member of the European Parliament, and I was there from 1999 and we worked together. I worked on the South African delegation and she personally helped me with my work. I remember that very vividly. Jo Cox was somebody that did stand out, and the tributes are very, very accurate. These are not tributes which are just happening because she happens to be somebody who died in these circumstances or happens to be hugely vivacious, photogenic, and has a great CV. She is, in fact, the person people are talking about. Somebody who was destined for great things because she had huge energy, she had huge intelligence, and she was extraordinarily capable. So within just a few months, she had made a very big impact on very tough issues, for example, the Syrian refugees and development issues, and very tough issues to deal with within the first few months as becoming an MP. So when we were in the European Parliament, she was very well thought of. She was an assistant who really stood out, and nobody was surprised when she rose in the ranks to become a very prominent MP. I think that didn't surprise any of us.
And of course, this throws up questions about MPs' security in the UK. Typically, these aren't the kind of attacks we expect there. Do you think more should be done to protect members of Parliament when they're out amongst their constituents?
I think that MPs, certainly as an MEP, we are very exposed. Just yesterday, I received a threatening call, with real threats, and we are very, very exposed. MPs are extremely exposed in the UK because they very often hold surgeries without appointments. We hold surgeries with appointments. But they tend to be very close. We have very small constituencies geographically under our system for MPs. I used to work for MPs in one of my first jobs when I was very young, so I know that they are very exposed. And as you have more austerity, as you have more pressures in society, as you have a worsening of the debate, and the referendum debate has been horrible. The press in Britain is particularly pernicious and nasty. It does affect a certain kind of person. You see this in social media, and MPs are very often the targets of this. They are trolled on social media. They're attacked in the press. The British press is can be particularly vindictive. It's particularly right-wing. It's particularly anti-EU, anti-migrant. And we have a lot of this kind of pressure. And MPs are very often the target. This can inflame many people on the streets. But austerity generally, the pressures on people can produce constituents who are under lots of pressures, and I think that creates more of a sense of pressure, and in extreme cases it can produce a sense of threat both online and in person for MPs in Britain.
Claude, I just want to ask you very quickly, what is the process now at the moment if you do receive one of those calls that you received, a threatening call like you did just yesterday?
Well, when I first became an MEP, I contacted the Metropolitan Police and Special Branch were involved. I've received bomb threats, and Special Branch were contacted. Scotland Yard were contacted. So I've been through that process myself. But this is not unusual, I've found, amongst MPs, getting threats, being attacked, and particularly women MPs. Women MPs are the subject of threats on social media, misogyny in particular. I've been the subject of racist trolling and threats. I'm of Indian origin. And you do get that. But the issue is that it is on the increase. Much of that is anecdotal, but there has been a recent study in the UK which has now been talked about more often. And that study showed that MPs are more exposed because we have a much more threatening culture with our press and our social media. But I think the press and others need to look at the political atmosphere in our country today and the way that it might be contributing as well to this sense of threat and sense of tension. It's just one contributing factor. And of course, there are the other pressures too. But yes, there is a sense of exposure at the moment. OK,
thank you very much, Claude Moraes, for your thoughts on Jo Cox, who was killed yesterday. France paid tribute earlier to a police couple stabbed to death at their home on Monday night in what has been labelled as a terror attack. Hundreds of police officers attended the ceremony, as well as the president, who praised the victims as heroes of daily life. Hollande promised to improve police protection.
It's unacceptable to think that these lives that were so promising were brutally destroyed, victims of a terrorist filled with hate. I will not accept that police or officers of the law be singled out because of the jobs they do. I and my government will also not accept them being the targets of slurs or insults.
French President François Hollande speaking there. Now, for the first time in Olympics history, a national team has been banned from competing. Russia's track and field athletes will not be at this summer's Rio Games. The decision was announced earlier by the International Association of Athletics Federations after a unanimous vote. The global governing body says Russia has not done enough to restore global confidence in the integrity of its athletes after a massive doping conspiracy. Well, for more on this, let's take you live now to our Moscow correspondent, Thomas Lowe. And Thomas, Russia says it's made those efforts to reform. So what's its response to this news now?
Well, its response is wide-ranging. A number of organisations and athletes have come forward and said in no uncertain terms what they think about this decision. The line which is really coming through both athletes and the media and politicians is that this is quite simply unjust, that it's unfair, and that it's been politicised, that this is more about politics than it is about sport. And as such, many Russians here, fed by the media, really suggest that really feel that this is the West having another go at Russia, picking Russia out. Now, one athlete, a double Olympic champion, Yelena Isinbayeva, has said since the decision that this is really against her human rights not to allow her to compete at the Olympics. She too says it's a political decision, and she says that she's willing to go to court to defend it, to defend her right to go and perform in Rio. The sports ministry has said it's extremely disappointed with the decision, that the decision should be fought, and that it's not reasonable to ban Russian athletes on the basis of collective responsibility. Clean athletes, it says, should have the right to prove themselves. And they'll be waiting for the IOC when it meets next week in a hope that they'll overturn this decision and let some Russian athletes take part.
And actually, we've just having news coming into us now that Putin has spoken, the Russian president, saying that this ban will not stop Russia in their fight against doping. So it seems that Russia is continuing to say that it is implementing those reforms, that it ought to be included in the Olympic Games. Thomas, were we expecting this decision today?
Well, there's no doubt that it was expected. It comes off the back of a hard-hitting number of investigations with a lot of evidence involved. So just this week, the World Anti-Doping Agency Task Force, which is in Russia now, testing athletes and making sure that adequate reforms are being put in place to allow Russian athletes to take part in the Rio Olympics. In their report, which is really quite damning, it says that more than 50 tests came back positive, and that more than 700 out of about 3,000 potential tests were either cancelled or declined. And in one example, they say that an athlete was in the middle of their race and basically ran away from the testers. So others had their addresses, their home addresses listed as being enclosed cities in Russia, which are sensitive sites, either for military purposes or nuclear purposes, that are very difficult to access for foreigners and very difficult to access for those people working for the task force too. So it seems, it really seems that if Russia is going to get any clean athletes to the Olympics, it's really up against it now.
Thomas Lowe in Moscow, thank you very much for that update. Thomas Lowe there, our correspondent in Moscow. Now, the second crucial black box from Egypt Air Flight 804 has now been found, a month after the plane crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, killing all 66 people on board. The discovery raises hopes that investigators will finally be able to determine what caused the crash. The black boxes contain the cockpit's voice recorder and also the flight recorder. Both France and the US are sending investigators to help Egyptian teams, who will now need to map the plane wreckage that they found yesterday. Iraqi forces have successfully recaptured the government headquarters in Fallujah, a city that's been under the control of the Islamic State group since January of 2014. Iraq's Prime Minister says only a few small pockets of IS fighters remain, but the US coalition emphasises that Iraqi forces have not yet regained control of the city, as Andrew Hillier reports.
As far as the eye can see, they keep coming. Hundreds upon hundreds of families, men, women and children, wretched and displaced by a war that has laid waste to their city. They're the lucky ones. They escaped alive. Aid groups say some 50,000 civilians are still inside Fallujah. The city has been under the iron grip of the Islamic State group for more than 2 years. Since then, its residents have known nothing but hardship.
We lived in fear and in starvation. Our kids were frightened when Islamic State was in control. They arrested men and insulted women. They did not respect anyone.
But the tide could finally be turning in the Iraqi government's favour. The head of Iraq's special forces say his men have entered the central Al-Nazal neighbourhood. He claims to have captured the main government complex that IS fighters were using as a base. Now he says his troops have turned their attention to a nearby hospital where jihadists are reportedly holed up. The Iraqi army launched an operation to retake Fallujah in late May. Weeks of brutal street-to-street combat have spared no one, least of all the families caught up in it. Although thousands have fled, some Sunni civilians have stayed, fearful of how they could be treated by Shia militias fighting alongside the Iraqi army.
It's time for some business news now, and Markus Karlsson's here. Hello, Markus.
Hello.
And we're starting in France, where more strikes are on the cards after an all-important meeting between the union chief and the government minister today.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about strikes, we've talked a lot about fuel shortages, we've talked a lot about street protests in the past few weeks or so, and the CGT union has been at the centre of all of that talk. It's been on the forefront of the protests against the French government's labour reform package. France's labour minister did indeed hold talks earlier with the leader of the CGT in a bid to end this standoff, but there was no sign of the two sides seeing eye to eye. Will Hildebrandt has more.
It was the first meeting between the government and the CGT union since protests began 3 months ago, but it was unable to break the impasse.
The CGT and the government disagree over some fundamental points. These disagreements were merely confirmed today.
CGT leader Philippe Martinez said there's no reason to call off protests slated for June 23rd and 28th. The union is staunchly opposed to a central tenet of the labor reforms that would allow companies to hire and fire workers with greater ease. The CGT's already staged blockades at oil refineries, nuclear power stations, and other facilities.
I think what we can criticize the CGT for is playing on people's anxieties, and that it's used the debate over this labor reform to also play on people's fears.
And while the labor law is unpopular in France, support for the strikes has waned. And that was before protests on Tuesday that descended into violence and left 40 people injured in Paris. The CGT is France's oldest and biggest union, with ties to the once powerful Communist Party. Today, it still flies a banner of fighting for the common man. But some wonder if it may have overplayed its hand, as more moderate movements such as France's second largest union, the CFDT, have successfully negotiated with the government.
And speaking of strikes, pilots at Air France are set to go on strike again next week. 3 pilots' unions are threatening industrial action between the 24th and the 27th of June. It follows a walkout earlier this month during a standoff with the airline over pay and conditions. The unions complain that the airline isn't listening to their demands. Now, shares in Apple came under pressure in New York trading on Friday. It followed the news that officials in Beijing, in China, ruled against the American electronics giant in a patent dispute. There's speculation that the legal standoff could force Apple to halt sales of certain iPhone models in the Chinese capital. Apple has made an appeal against the patent ruling and says that all of its phones remain on sale in China and in Beijing. Now, Apple shares closed nearly 2.3% down over in the United States, and that put pressure on the wider stock market stateside. All 3 main indices in the United States closed in negative territory, as you can see right there, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average down by around about 0.33%. Healthcare stocks were among the laggards alongside technology shares, and overall it was a pretty negative week for American stocks, and we saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average, for instance, posting its worst week in 5. In Europe, the indices closed in positive territory, though traders seemed to be thinking during this session that the likelihood of a Brexit is decreasing. That helped European stocks and also the British pound. Now, banking shares did well on the latest developments in the Greek debt crisis. Let's take a look at that and other stories in brief now. The Eurozone is unlocking €7.5 billion worth of financial aid for Greece. The single currency area's bailout fund has backed the tranche, saying that Greece has completed the required reforms. Eurozone finance ministers have also given the green light. The money is meant to ensure that Greece has enough to pay its bills until year end. Germany's Siemens and Spanish renewable energy group Gamesa are teaming up in wind power. They're combining their wind turbine making, creating one of the world's biggest actors in this sector. As part of the deal, Siemens is paying Gamesa shareholders just over €1 billion. In return, Siemens will hold 59% of the new venture and Gamesa shareholders 41%. And Mitsubishi Motors is planning to give the owners of 4 types of minivans close to $1,000. The Japanese car maker has outlined the compensation after overstating the fuel economy of these vehicles. Mitsubishi admitted in April to misleading its customers and said that 625,000 minivans were affected. The compensation is expected to cost Mitsubishi Motors more than $600 million. And that is the business news for now.
Markus Karlsson, thank you very much for that. And it's time for Media Watch now. Crossing over the desk, Emma James is here. Hi, Emma.
Hi.
And you've been looking today at the reactions coming through to the death of Jo Cox, the British politician. Just one day afterwards, these reactions, kind of people trying to weigh up what happened.
Yes, people were really trying to come to terms with what was such a brutal and shocking act, and the reverberations being felt right across the United Kingdom, but nowhere more so than in West Yorkshire, where, of course, Jo Cox was born, brought up, and where she was elected to be a Member of Parliament. The Yorkshire Evening Post's editor tweeted this morning: "We wake not quite believing what happened yesterday. I hope we did you proud, Jo." And their front page features just the words "Our Jo," alongside a quotation from the statement from her husband Brendan, in which he said he hoped that the pair's children would be bathed in love and that people would unite to fight the hatred that had killed his wife. Many people in some way hoping that there can be something positive to take out of this terrible, terrible tragedy. Alison Pearson, a journalist for The Telegraph, says that for the UK to take in the 3,000 unaccompanied Syrian children that Jo Cox had campaigned for will be both a fitting tribute and a living memorial to her. Others, though, really just very angry about the way in which this EU referendum has played out in the United Kingdom. Robert Harris, the author, tweeting this: "How foul this referendum is, the most depressing, divisive, duplicitous political event of my lifetime. May there never be another." Owen Jones, the Guardian journalist, says, "I love this country, but never have I been so scared about it. The growing bitterness, resentment and hatred is genuinely frightening." And there are continued disagreements really on how the death and the stories that follow should be treated. Louise Mensch, a former Conservative MP, has written this on the right-wing news site that she now runs, saying that politicising Jo Cox's death is the worst. She claims that far too many on the Remain side of the referendum campaign have used Cox's tragic death for political point scoring, but she doesn't go on to name any names. On the other side of the fence, The Spectator caused quite a bit of controversy with a blog that was posted yesterday, A Day of Infamy by Alex Massey. It was actually taken down before being reposted with some of the lines taken out. In it, he says things like, when you encourage rage, you cannot then feign surprise when people become enraged. The edited version you can find on Twitter. People have posted what was originally said so that you can judge for yourself just how inflammatory you believe those comments to be.
And that kind of language of hate and also of fear have really been thrown into the spotlight with this event. There's one particular campaign poster that's caused a lot of controversy, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. Breaking Point is the title on the poster. It was launched by Nigel Farage shortly before the events in West Yorkshire. And it is basically, by some, deemed to be inciting racial hatred, so much so that some people have actually commented and called the police and reported it as a crime. A prominent Conservative Leave campaigner, Boris Johnson, though, has distanced himself from this particular image. The interesting thing to note is that the photograph was actually taken on the Croatia-Slovenia border in 2015. So this has nothing to do with, this is not rampaging hordes appearing on the coast of Kent. This is an image that has been used to portray a particular story, and some people feel that that really isn't right, that it should be used in that way. You'll also notice that the only prominent person in this photograph has actually been covered by the words "Leave the European Union" and a white box, just to emphasise the fact that really they're trying to ratchet up the racist element of this. Also on Twitter, people have been pointing out the similarities between this image and images seen in a Nazi propaganda movie. So very, very hateful stuff emerging. Whether or not that was the Leave campaign's intention, that parallel is there. Now, other people are pointing fun at this and really trying to make light of it and say, you know, their piece, but with a little bit of humour. And some of the best versions of the posters as they have been fixed by Twitter users. This one, Breaking Point, with a sea of Farages. Another one here with English football hooligans replacing the crowds of migrants. And Steve Bell for The Guardian has this one, the words "breaking point" replaced by "hating point."
It's good to see that people haven't lost a little bit of their sense of sarcastic humour there. Emma James with the Media Watch, thank you very much for that. And that's it for this half hour, but I'll be back after the break with the rest of the show. Do stay with me.
Special event.
Will they stay or will they go? That is the question.